Canada's Information Commissioner investigating now whether the federal government is breaking the rules by imposing limits on some scientists and what they can say and when they can speak to the media. The probe comes after a request from the University of Victoria's Environmental Law Clinic wrote to Suzanne Legault complaining about the federal practice. Take a listen to what it says. In sharp contrast to past Canadian practice and the current U.S. government practice, the federal government, they say, has recently made concerted efforts to prevent the media and, through them, the general public from speaking to government scientists. And this, in turn, impoverishes the public debate on issues of significant national concern. This has raised a lot of questions. Should the federal government's attempts to limit scientists speaking be ruled illegal? Is it really about muzzling scientists, as the report says, with evidence that may refute federal policy? Or is it just fair practice to ensure that federally funded research is properly protected and controlled? Joining me now from Calgary is Kellie Leitch. She's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Human Resources and Skills Development. In Halifax is Megan Leslie, the NDP Environment Critic. And in Toronto, the Liberal Treasury Board Critic, John McCallum. Looking at this report, the Environmental Law Clinic has asked, and Democracy Watch has asked the Information Commissioner to investigate whether or not it is legal for scientists to be prevented from speaking to the media, and that they characterize it, Kellie Leitch, as muzzling. What's your view?
Well, I guess I completely disregard that premise. We know, and the facts state for themselves, that whether it be at Environment Canada, where there's been over 1,000 interviews and articles published, whether it be at Agriculture Canada, or whether it be at Natural Resources, that scientists and other individuals are allowed to publish, which is probably the best way to make sure that you are heard from the scientific community, and are allowed to do interviews. You know, from my personal experience, having been an individual who has done basic scientific research as well as run a lab, the best way for me to communicate to my colleagues and to the public was by publishing. Well, we have scientists who are world-renowned amongst our public servants. They work for the National Research Council of Canada, they work for Agriculture Canada, they work for Natural Resources Canada. They do outstanding work and they publish it so that people worldwide know about it. And I'm proud of those Canadians. I'm proud of what they do, and I'm proud that they get to publish so that people all over the world know what they're doing and that it's second to none.
But just quickly, the report gives countless examples here. The 2012 Canadian scientists from Environment Canada attending the International Polar Year 2012 conference in Montreal, essentially being told here, if they're asked for an interview, say you'll get back to them, don't talk to a journalist there. Yes, they're publishing the report, but you know, obviously between the publishing of the report and talking to the scientists to understand the context and get them on the record, has there been a tightening, a restriction of scientists, as some scientists say, and we'll talk to one on this program as well, they say they have been restricted from free access to the media. Why is that?
Well, look, Evan, there is a primary spokesman for every department, and that's the Minister of the Crown. But let's be very clear. Scientists in Canada are second to none in the world. They publish prolifically. In fact, for our country, we do an outstanding job of making sure that we have opportunities to publish. And those are both people who work in the public service as scientists and those individuals that work at academic institutions like I was at the University of Toronto or at the University of Western Ontario. We need to be proud of those people, and I am. I'm delighted that they get an opportunity to publish because that's the best way for their colleagues and other Canadians and other people around the world to hear about what they're doing.
So what do you say to scientists?
They get a great opportunity to do that routinely.
But some scientists clearly are saying that they're muzzled. Jeffrey Hutchison, professor of Canada Research Chair at Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at Dalhousie, said, "We have somehow deemed it okay and permissible for an iron curtain to be drawn across the communication of science in this country." What do you say to scientists who don't feel they're getting, you know, they're feeling, and this is the word this report uses, they're feeling muzzled?
Look, I don't know whether or not they're feeling or not feeling something, but what I do know is we are publishing. We're making sure that Canadians and other individuals across the world know what our scientists are doing, and we do that routinely. So whether that be over 1,000 publications in Environment Canada and the same at Agriculture Canada, whether it be huge numbers of publications out of Natural Resources, we are giving scientists an opportunity to make sure they're known worldwide because they are the best in the world. And I would encourage every scientist that we have to keep working hard in their lab. We support Canadian scientists second to none. You know, $8 billion more have been invested in science in this country since 2006.
But the issue, to be fair,
my students have been beneficiaries
but
of
to
that.
be fair, we're not talking about the investment in science. We're talking about whether that the scientists then have the right to communicate their research. And let me just bring in
You're
Megan
correct,
Leslie.
Evan. It's about communicating, and that's about publishing. Any scientist will tell you that, and given an
But
opportunity
clearly some
to do
scientists
peer...
aren't. I mean, this is what I'm trying to say. Megan Leslie, what's your view? Is it, as Kelly Leitch is saying, it's really about how much you're publishing. There's no muzzle on the publication. Therefore, what's the problem here? It's a communication strategy.
There's a huge problem here. Publishing is one thing, but why aren't these folks allowed to talk to the media? Why aren't they allowed to talk about the work that they're doing? We have numerous examples of this not being the case, and you've seen quite a number of editorials recently, whether it's scientific publications or the Science Writers Association coming forward and saying, what is going on here? Let our scientists speak. And it's kind of disturbing that they're doing that, and they're saying that about our government, about the Canadian government. And even the Science Writers Association, they won a Freedom of Press Award talking about us and our country and the fact that we're not letting our scientists speak.
But now
very
what's
troubling.
the problem with a department essentially saying, if you want to speak, go through the spokesperson. There's a process. Every company does that. It's very rare at any company that an employee can just talk to a media. I would love it. But what is fundamentally the problem there with a communication strategy?
I think we all have our different roles, and sure, you have communications people who are experts in communications, but I think we should have access to those scientists who can actually talk about their work. I don't think it's fair or even just to have a communications person, summarizing in 2 or 3 talking points what it is that's in a paper. I think we should be able to have access to those scientists, pose questions, maybe get some answers, maybe have the scientists say, that's not a part of my study, you should talk to someone else. Why can't we talk to those people? They work for our government.
And then John McCallum, what's your view? I'm reading some of these letters here. Here's a scientist named David Tarasik, Experimental Studies, Air Quality Research Division, saying to a reporter, I'd be delighted to talk to you, but I'd rather doubt I'm allowed to. I'm required to refer you to the media relations. My apologies for the strange behavior. Is that normal?
No, I think this is quite frightening, Orwellian, 1984-ish. I'll give you one example. A scientist published an article in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, on the declining state of the Pacific salmon. And that person was not allowed to speak to the media about this. And, Kelly just said that the primary spokesperson is the minister. But with all due respect, the minister knows nothing about this article published in the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. The author does. And it's Canadian taxpayers who pay the salaries of these scientists, and now they're not being allowed to communicate through the media their findings to Canadians. This was never the case in Canada before. It's not the case in the United States today. It's an unprecedented move for the government to muzzle taxpayer-financed scientists, some of whom publish articles in the leading journals in the world, and now Canadians are not allowed to hear the results. Not many Canadians read Nature, might I say. So it's very important.
Actually, many do, John. It's fabulous that they do, because we're exceptionally well
Many do,
educated.
maybe a few hundreds. We're talking about millions of Canadians who have right to this information, and the vast majority of which do not read Nature.
Kelly Leitch, I'm trying to get it. When you read this, there's essentially, spin lines that the department is telling the scientists to read. Has industry been approached about paying for this? And you're supposed to say this. I'm a scientist. I'm reading this. I am not in a position to answer that question. I'd be happy to refer you to their appropriate spokesperson. Then there's a whole list of things of what to say should a journalist ask you. Okay response, better response. I guess my point is, why feed scientists lines about research that taxpayers are paying for?
Exactly.
Why can't they just talk to us about their research?
Well, let's be very clear, Evan. They do talk to you. You've had ample opportunity, and you do get opportunities to speak to scientists all the time. And I've mentioned several times now on this program, whether it be over 1,000 scientists that have done interviews and publications at Environment Canada, whether it be over 1,000 that have done interviews and published with respect to their research done at Agriculture Canada, and there's numerous other examples. So let's be very clear.
I know you're
scientists know that,
but it's not. But like, with all due respect, I know that you're saying that they do interviews, but I don't think that's to be expected. Of course, they're doing interviews, but some of them are clearly saying they're not allowed to do enough interviews.
Evan, scientists that are asked questions about their research that they know well, they answer truthfully. To say that they would do otherwise, I think, is misleading the public. Let's be clear. When I was a scientist, when I was doing my clinical research, when I was asked a direct question, I answered the question directly because I cared passionately about my research. Our scientists who work for the public service are exactly the same. And they answer clearly because they know their research well, and they are allowed and provided the opportunity to do so. So I would encourage you to do exactly that, which is speak to these people who are doing great work for Canadians.
But
and as I said, we have invested, Evan, $8 billion more in research since 2006. That means there's more available. There's more people to speak to.
But Kelly,
that means that there's great young scientists out there who can talk to you.
You're answering a question that I'm not asking. With all due respect here, I'm asking why then, if scientists are allowed to say whatever they want, am I reading a form that tells scientists how to answer questions and how not to answer questions, to put it to a media spokesperson? That's an important question. If they're free to answer, that's one thing. Clearly, they're not. My question is are those limits too tight?
Evan, as I said to you before, when you're a researcher and you sit in your lab and you do great scientific work, world-renowned work in the case of most Canadians, you answer truthfully and you answer exactly what you have done your research on. Our scientists do exactly the same.
All right. Well, I'm trying to get at. I'm not suggesting anyone's not answering truthfully. My question, and I'll put this to the opposition now. Are they allowed to answer? Is the question, whether it's truthfully or not. But what's your take? Should
Evan,
there
as
be
I've
more
said to you,
access
they've done thousands of interviews.
I'd say, the Conservatives did run on a campaign of accountability and transparency, and this totally flies in the face of it. We've seen too many examples, scientists coming forward saying they're not allowed to speak, these kinds of documents getting out with this message guide about how to speak and when to speak or not to speak. And it's pretty hard to believe. I admire this application to see whether or not the Information Commissioner thinks this is legitimate. I think it's a good question to be asking. Personally, I don't think it is legitimate.
John McCallum, what's your take? I mean, should there be some rules? I mean, there must be some communication rules. Your own party has communication rules. I appreciate that. The question is, what level are they at? And in your view, have we moved from an evidence-based to a policy-based communication?
Well, look, Callie's answered your questions for several minutes without answering your question, because the issue is not what she's talking about. The issue is, why not allow a scientist publishing in the most prestigious journal, Nature, to speak about his or her findings to the media? And that person was not allowed, and that's what I say is Orwellian, contrary to anything that's happened in Canadian history in the past, contrary to what happens in the United States today, and not fair to taxpayers who support that research. You cannot expect a minister to answer science-based questions on the state of the Pacific salmon compared with the person who wrote the article. So to say that he's the principal spokesman for the party is irrelevant, because he's not the principal spokesman on scientific issues which he doesn't understand anywhere near as well as the scientists who write them.
All right. To be fair, it says when there's a national media request from a national media outlet, it goes to the Minister's DCOM, Director of Communication. So a very interesting report. We'll find out the results of this. Kelly Leitch, Megan Leslie, John McCallum, I appreciate your time talking about this today. All right, this makes interesting reading. Exactly the communication strategy for scientists. If you ever get a chance to read it, how to talk to journalists and how to respond properly according to this communication strategy. Certainly enlightening reading for us. Canada's Information Commissioner is now weighing on whether setting limits on when scientists can speak is worth an investigation. Some government scientists are lashing out against what they perceive as unnecessary government control. The government says it's reasonable to ensure the integrity of federally funded research. Is the government working to protect the public interest, or is it muzzling scientists? That's the word used in a new report. and limiting the national debate. We just heard from MPs on this. Let's hear from a scientist. Joining me now from Victoria's Andrew Weaver. He's a climate scientist at the University of Victoria. He's also the deputy leader of the Green Party of British Columbia. Thanks for being here, Mr. Weaver.
Thank you for having me on your show.
All right, you just saw the MPs debate this report here. Walk us through what you see in this report. Is there, in your view, evidence that the government is actively preventing scientists from speaking to the media, or is this simply what most private companies have, a communication plan?
There is so much evidence, it's overwhelming, and there are many, many examples that weren't even included in that report. The example, for example, of the earthquake in Ottawa, where Canadian media tried to get information from the Canadian Geological Survey on the earthquake that happened in Ottawa. Because of, nobody could talk to the media, they couldn't get any information. They had to go to the U.S. Geological Survey to get information on an earthquake, as it was shortly after it happened in Ottawa. The examples are everywhere in this.
Did you ever experience any of this?
I'm a university scientist, so as a university scientist, I'm protected with academic freedom. But I do know many, many colleagues in Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Natural Resources Canada, Environment Canada, who have experienced this directly. So there's ample evidence, and there's many, many studies.
But is it a
this.
new? I mean, I'm reading this report, and
Yeah.
there's lots of emails going back and forth. But just characterize this. Is this something new, and what do you think is behind it?
Well, it is new under the Harper regime. Is what happened is that slowly but surely the access to scientific information has been limited with time. It's got to the stage now that, your Conservative MP spoke about them publishing. Well, in fact, that's the latest target. If you read the latest information coming out of DFO, they are now taking away the ability of the scientist to transfer copyright on behalf of the Crown when in publishing to a bureaucrat. And now there's also forcing people in other countries to sign confidentiality agreements with Canadians.
But to be fair, listen, as the deputy leader of the Green Party in BC, and you use words like the Harper regime, you might be seeing this through clearly trying to score some political points here. Kelly Leitch is saying scientists still grant thousands of interviews. She just said that. What's your view on that?
Well, in fact, you can look at, I looked at these numbers, and the Environment Canada as a collective gave similar amounts of reviews as I did as an individual over the last couple of years. I mean, a slight exaggeration there. They're proud about the numbers that they talk about, but those numbers are actually not very impressive. In fact, there is a memo, I don't know whether it's in the report, showing that Environment Canada media responses went down 80% with the introduction of their media protocol. So there is very clearly attempts to limit. And the reason why, of course, it's also quite clear, and I've been involved in this communication of science long before I ever agreed to run in the provincial government with Green Party. What's happening here is that when you have policy and you want to market policy to a population, it's very inconvenient if there's scientific information available to the population that undermines that policy. So what is happening here in Canada is we're having a suppression of information, so that rather than having evidence-based decision-making, we're more into the framework of having decision-based evidence-making, seeking the evidence that backs a decision that's made politically, and not giving the public free access to the information that would allow them to determine whether or not they support a particular policy or not.
The Information Commission of Canada is now looking at the evidence and considering an investigation. In your view, is the federal government breaking the law?
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't make a judgment on the law, but I do think it's a very serious thing that's going on in Canada. I think it actually strikes the very fabric of what we as Canadians believe it means to be Canadian. We want to feel free and have access to information. The Liberal MP mentioned the word Orwellian. I actually would take it even a step further, and I remember the days of when, under the old former Soviet regime, where you'd have Russian scientists going to conferences and being followed by KGB people.
But I mean, come on. I mean, you're comparing
That's happening.
No,
Absolutely.
But you're comparing this to the Soviet Union. I mean, listen, I mean, there may be a point here, but isn't that a bridge too far?
No, because under the Soviet system, they were allowed to publish. They were only allowed to go to conferences, and they were followed by
But are you saying that data is being changed, or that scientists are? I mean,
no, they never did that under the Soviet regime either. But when they went to conferences, as is happening in Environment Canada, people followed them to ensure when they spoke to media, there was somebody listening. That is happening now with Environment Canada scientists going to international meetings.
So what is the consequence, in your view, of all this?
It undermines the importance of science in terms of its role in a democratic society in terms of decision making. Science can never prescribe policy solutions. Science is there to provide information on which policy is formulated. There's many things that come to play in the formulation of policy, many views and opinions, but when you suppress access to one from the general public, it strikes at the very essence of what we value in a democratic society, at free access to information on which to make decisions, on which to determine whether we as a society support or don't support policy being made by our elected leaders.
All right. Andrew Weaver, climate scientist at the University of Victoria, deputy leader of the Green Party of British Columbia. You've been talking about this issue for a long time. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Thank you, sir.